and welcome back to another episode of Lovehorsepower.com. Last time we showed you how to remove the head to replace the head gasket on this 91 MR2 Turbo. Today we're going to be showing you how to clean the head, remove the valve springs and valves, and get those valves cleaned up. We also noticed that the oil pan gasket is leaking on this MR2, so we're going to show you how to remove the oil pan without completely removing that exhaust. And since we got the oil pan off, well, we'll also show you how to remove a piston too. But first, let's go take a look at that head and get started. Now that we've got the head removed, we need to get this thing seriously cleaned up. On the intake side, the valves don't look too dirty, but we'll remove them anyway so that we can replace those valve stem seals. The exhaust valves are really dirty though. We gotta get those things cleaned up and reclaim that horsepower. First, let's take off those camshaft pulleys, the number 3 metal timing belt cover, and the idler pulley. Next up, we can unbolt those bearing caps. Each camshaft is held in place by 5 bearing caps with 2 bolts each. Use the service manual to remove the bolts in the correct order and loosen them in several passes. Do this with each camshaft, 20 bolts in all. Keep the bearing caps and bolts in order and in the orientation they were in when they were installed. When you reinstall the camshafts, the bearing caps go back exactly where they came off from and in the same orientation. To remove the shim and bucket assembly is really easy. Just use a magnet and pull them out. As with everything else we'll take off the head, don't forget to keep them in order. Using a valve spring compressor tool such as this one and a piece of cut copper pipe from the local hardware store, compress the valve spring. Once the valve spring is compressed, use a magnet to pull out the valve keepers or retainer clips. Let's check it out. As we saw earlier, remove the shim and bucket assembly using the magnet. Now get your piece of copper pipe and position it on top of the valve retainer. Position the valve spring compressor tool on top of the copper pipe. Now I like to hold my hand over the pipe to prevent the keepers from popping out. These little guys are really easy to lose. Then compress the spring. Now get that magnet again and pull out those keepers. Then uncompress the spring and remove it along with the retainer. Now get to it! You've got 15 more to get done. Once the valve spring assembly is removed, you can remove the valve. Just push it from the top of the valve stem, through the valve stem seal, and out the bottom. Take a look at that exhaust valve. It's got some seriously hard, horsepower-robbing carbon buildup. Using some needle nose pliers, twist and pull off those old valve stem seals, and get rid of them. Whoa! Look at those combustion chambers. They need a serious cleaning. You know what I see? I see horsepower about to be reclaimed. You can use a semi-soft wire brush to get it most of the way clean. Then clean the whole thing up with brake cleaner. Don't use the brake cleaner in your lawn. It makes wives very unhappy. Make sure you finish cleaning it up before installing new valve stem seals. So, check it out. See what a little time and elbow grease can do? To keep yourself motivated, just think of all that yummy, delicious horsepower you'll have. And keep in mind the hot spots you're removing from the combustion chamber that can promote detonation. Now we can replace those valve stem seals with new ones. Put some clean engine oil on the seal using your fingers or an oil pump, and then use needle nose pliers or magnet and gently place the seal onto the valve guide. And simply use your fingers to push the seal into place. Let's take a look at that one more time. With the valve removed, we can get to cleaning it. I'm using a standard drill and a brass wire brush. Place the drill into a vise, crank it up, and clean all that carbon off of the valve. Be sure not to scratch the valve stem, just clean the valve face. Alright, with all the valves clean, let's review how to reassemble. Okay, this is the 3S GT head. Now here's a typical valve spring assembly on the intake side. And here is an intake valve. This is the valve stem. And here's this little groove here where these retainer clips fit to hold the valve in place. This is the valve seat. Now the intake valve comes in through the bottom and up through the valve stem seal. And the spring assembly goes down in there over the top of that. You then compress the spring down, and with the spring compressed, you put in these clips to hold it in place. Once that's done, you take the bucket, which contains this shim to adjust the valve clearance, and place that on top. To reassemble the head, get your nice clean valve and lube it on up with some engine oil. You know you like to do it. Everyone likes Slick Mobile 1 on their fingers. Insert the valve through the guide and the new valve stem seal. Now take the valve spring and retainer assembly and drop it over the top of the valve. Use that spring compressor tool we showed earlier along with a piece of copper pipe. You can pick up that copper pipe piece at your local parts store and just cut it to the appropriate length. Now compress the spring down using the tool. I used a slightly magnetic screwdriver to hold the keepers or clips and then drop them into the retainer. It takes some time to get it right, but you'll get it eventually. You've got 15 more to do. Once the keepers are lined up with the valve stem groove, uncompress the spring and you're done. Time to move on to the next one. Oh, crap. Okay, we finally got our head removed. Now next we had to get the head as clean as possible, and to do that we had to pretty much remove everything we can off of this head. We started by removing the camshaft pulleys, the camshaft bearing caps, and the camshafts themselves. Then removed the shim and buckets and used a valve spring compressor to compress each spring and remove the retainer clips, the valve spring, the valve, and finally the valve stem seal. Next we used a drill and a wire brush to clean the valves and the valve stem seal. We then cleaned the combustion chambers as well as possible to remove any carbon or any other dirt in there that could make hot spots, which could promote detonation. Now next, we then had to reassemble the head. So we used new valve stem seals and used that spring compressor tool we showed earlier to compress the springs, put those retainer clips back in, and then put the shim and bucket back on top. Now, next, we're going to reassemble the head outside the engine by putting the camshafts back in, the camshaft bearing caps, and the camshaft pulleys. Now this time around, we're going to be using ARP hardware to assemble the head to the block, which should prevent any problems with the head lifting from the block. So what do you say we get this thing reinstalled? When installing the cams, make sure you keep any dirt off of the bearing caps. I like to use some compressed air to remove any dirt or dust. Apply some sealant to the number 1 bearing cap on the edges as shown in the service manual. You can use Toyota sealant or some RTV from your local parts store. Then lubricate the bearing caps and the valve shims with some engine oil. Here at Lovehorsepower, we like to use Mobile 1. While holding the camshaft, also lube it up before dropping it into the head. Make sure to get oil on the cam lobes as well. You can use either engine oil or some assembly lube. Twist the camshaft so that it falls down into the bearing caps. Have the camshaft lobes on the timing belt side aiming away from the head. Then install the bearing caps and torque them in the order specified in the service manual. Make sure to do it in several passes. Now it's time to put in new camshaft seals. You did buy those, right? Make sure to lube them up with some grease. It makes installing them much easier. If you don't have an appropriate tool to push in the camshaft seal, just use a hammer and an Allen wrench. Just work slowly and around the seal and you'll get it done. A much better tool for this would be a very large socket, probably a 36mm, and a hammer. When you're finished, the seal should be about flush with the camshaft bearing cap. When installing the camshaft pulleys, locate the mark on the pulley and aim it straight up. Place the pulley onto the camshaft and push the lock pin through the top hole. Using a 24mm wrench, hold the camshaft in place while you torque the bolt to specification. Before we move forward with the head install, we gotta get this oil pan oil leak fixed up as we mentioned earlier. You don't have to completely remove the stock exhaust to get to the oil pan. Just unbolt the 3 nuts holding the exhaust to the converter, the 2 bolts holding the exhaust pipe onto the muffler, and the 2 small 10mm nuts bracing the pipe to the muffler. This will allow the exhaust pipe to be free and can be moved out of the way, and is way easier than completely removing the stock exhaust. Next, disconnect the oil level sensor wire and remove the sensor. In our case, the sensor was broken anyway, so we just left it in. If yours is working though, remove it. It's expensive and you'll probably end up breaking it when you drop that pan. With the exhaust pipe and sensor out of the way, just unbolt the 9 bazillion bolts and nuts holding the oil pan onto the block. Once you have them all out, the oil pan will probably be stuck on there by the form-in-place gasket stuff that Toyota uses. I found it best to use a knife and cut the seal around the pan instead of using a screwdriver. This prevents bending the pan, and if you do that, trust me, it will always leak, so just take your time and get it done. With the oil pan finally off, we gotta get back to more cleaning. Drain all the oil out and soak up the rest with some rags. Then clean it all up with my personal favorite, brake cleaner. Get all the old gasket material off too. When you go to reinstall that pan, I found that the Toyota form-in-place gasket maker really works best to seal that pan back up. As we mentioned earlier, we're going to show how to remove a piston. It's actually really easy. Well, once you have the head and oil pan off. First, depending on which piston you want to remove, you'll probably have to unbolt the oil pickup and the windage tray. If the engine has a lot of miles on it, you might need to use a ridge reamer to remove carbon buildup from up top so that the piston can be pushed out. Before we go ahead and pull out a piston, check out all this neat stuff under here. You can see the crankshaft bearings, and rod bearings. You can also see the bottom of the pistons. This heavy crankshaft thing spins at an amazing 7,200 RPM. That's incredible! To remove a piston, unbolt the two nuts holding the lower rod bearing onto the crankshaft and remove the bearing. Then get some fuel hose and slide it over the studs so that you don't scratch any of the bearing or cylinder wall surfaces. Then push it out from the bottom using your thumbs. It's that easy. With the piston removed, you can clearly see the piston oil squirter. These spray oil onto the bottom of the pistons to promote cooling and help limit detonation by removing heat from the piston. Keep in mind that the only heat transfer path for a piston is through the rings and through the engine oil. That's it. All those explosions transferring heat to the top of the piston, and it has to be cooled primarily only through those teeny rings. Wow! So, how do you get that piston back in? Well, you gotta go out and spend $10 for a ring compressor. I found one at the local Napa store. Use lots of engine oil, put the piston in the compressor, compress the rings, and place the assembly over the borehole on the block. Line it up flush with the deck, and then just tap in the piston with the handle of a hammer. After the piston is back in and the rod bolts torqued, reinstall the windage tray and oil strainer. Place some of Toyota's form-in-place gasket maker on the oil pan as shown, and bolt it back up. Be sure to torque the bolts and nuts evenly so that there won't be any leaks. Okay, now, what were we doing again? Oh yeah, we gotta get that head back on to go get boosting. First we gotta lube up the ARP studs using the included lubricant. Then screw the studs into the block using an Allen wrench. Phew, that's some seriously fast speed screwing, if you know what I mean. We'll be back to boosting in no time. Now let's make sure the deck is clean and drop our new head gasket in place. In this case, we chose to use the TRD gasket with a .9mm thickness. Alright, let's get that head back on. Make sure it's clean, and maybe blow it out one last time with some compressed air. It's best to do this step with two people. Convince a buddy, wife, or brother that it will be a really good time. I mean, it will, right? Make sure nothing's in the way and line up the head with the studs and lower it down evenly. You might need to check it out using a flashlight. Make sure it's down all the way against the block. Check it out with a light and just make sure nothing is in the way and that it's down flush.
Looks like it's down. Oh yeah, it's down.
Well now, we didn't get as far as I had hoped in this episode, but at least we did get the head installed. So, next time on Love Horsepower, we're going to show you how to install the other stuff that needs to go in, such as the intake manifold, exhaust manifold, distributor, and that tricky timing belt. So then, we can finally go get boosting. We'll see you then.